time, the White House is drawing an ire of a reporter. Simon Ateba, a White House correspondent, has accused the White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre of discriminating between media personals during a White House press briefing. During a tribute to the cast of Ted Lasso held at the White House, Ateba aired his feelings when he yelled at White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, saying, "You've been discriminating against me, you've been discriminating against some people in the briefing room." Ateba accused Jean-Pierre of ignoring smaller channels and favouring bigger channels such as ABC News and others. This is not the first time Ateba has faced such discrimination from the governing body. Ateba has also not been assigned a seat in the press room and resorts to standing at the back during the press briefing. Ateba went on to state that the continuation of the colonial mentality of looking down on people from Africa still prevails in the White House during the Biden administration. The main question that lies here today is, does the White House have a colonial mentality or not? In fact, Simon Ateba, who is the Today News Africa correspondent of the White House, joins me live. Many thanks to you, Simon. Can't thank you enough for joining in on our show today to express your thoughts. You stated on record that you worked very hard to strengthen the relationship between US and Africa despite not being paid in the last 3 years. And yet you say the White House has discriminated against you. Why do you say so?
So first of all, thank you for having me on the show. This is my first time and I'm glad to be here. You know, our job is to make those in power uncomfortable and comfort those who are weak. And that's the job that is everywhere. It's about the job. Our job is to ask tough questions, do great investigations. My job is not to be friend to the president of the US or even to the press secretary. She doesn't need to like me to give me questions. And you know, by doing that job, by asking the tough questions and trying to do my job, I've realized that when you do that, sometimes you are sidelined. And that has happened to me, you know, many times in the past 3 years since I've been really focused on covering the White House every day. Let me ask you a question. If the president of the US is receiving 50 African leaders, as President Biden did last December during the second US-Africa Leaders Summit, and there's an African in the briefing room, won't you give that African the opportunity to ask questions?
Right.
When you fail to do that, what you're doing is pure discrimination, and it's not just disrespect for me, it's also disrespect for the continent of Africa you are trying to strengthen ties with.
Is it true that the White House Correspondents Association has booted you out, and why so?
Yes, for doing my job and asking the tough questions and just trying to strengthen ties and relation between the US and interaction between the US and Africa. The White House Correspondents Association connived with the White House to get rid of me. It didn't renew my membership. They couldn't get rid of me, and they waited for my membership to expire. And when I reapplied, they didn't allow me to be a member of the association. But that doesn't mean I'm not covering the White House. I continue to cover the White House. What it means is, in the next 4 days, President Biden and the First Lady and the Vice President will attend the White House Correspondents Association dinner, and I'm not allowed to be there. I wasn't allowed to buy a ticket. And all this is just for doing my job and saying that it has to do with the job. Journalists have to do their job. We are not there to become friends with the people in power. And when you do that, you face the consequences, even in the White House, which is surprising.
Absolutely. Simon, you say you've not been allowed to ask a single question in the last 7 months, and that Jen Psaki did not let you take questions for 15 months. Is there a bias towards African journalists? If so, then why do you say so?
Yes, so I've not been allowed to ask questions. I've not been called on by the press secretary in the past 8 months. And for doing my job. And, you know, as I asked you earlier, the president hosted 50 African leaders in Washington, D.C. last December. And even during that time, I wasn't allowed to ask a question. A week before then, the president of France who colonized Africans came to the White House, and he was received by President Biden. And the French journalists who covered the White House were allowed to ask multiple questions. So it shows you the level of disrespect and the level of disregard for Africa. And this is really sad, because today News Africa is just trying to strengthen ties and interaction between the US and Africa by providing accurate and relevant information. And I'm unable to do that.
You know, Simon, I'll have to delve deeper into this, because you've actually made some shocking revelations. Does this bias, according to you, indicate a colonial mentality of the Biden administration? Because let's not forget that Biden's premise of winning the current presidency and for re-election has also been freedom and one to offer equality.
Yes, exactly. Today News Africa, our publication, endorsed then candidate Biden, because we believe that he made a lot of promises. He was this guy who was going to change everything in Washington, D.C. He was the guy for the little guy, the black, the brown, and the white people. And only for me to face those challenges and that discrimination in the White House, which is really sad. What I will say is, when it comes to colonial mentality, it's the ability to, it's looking down on people and thinking that you don't need to engage them. You don't need to give a journalist from Africa question right in the White House to ask you questions about the US-Africa summit that you're about to host. And for people watching us right now, Africa has between 54 and 55 countries. So when you have 50 African leaders who are in Washington, D.C., it means the entire continent of Africa has come to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Biden. Yet the guy covering Africa in the White House is not allowed by the press secretary to ask questions. If that is not discrimination, I don't know what is.
Right. Simon, I want to know what decides a correspondent's chances to get called on for a question during a White House press briefing.
Usually you need to send topics in advance to the White House, or the White House will reach out to you.
Right. But I'm also reading reports and comments from you as well, which have gone on to indicate that this is also becoming a matter of proximity with the press secretary at the White House.
Yes, you have to be close to the press secretary, but that's not my job. My job is to do the job, ask questions, investigate, report the truth and the fact. Anywhere, in Turkey, in US, in Nigeria, in any country around the world, that's our job. The press secretary doesn't have to be my friend. I don't have to be her friend. It's the job. That's what I'm saying. It's the job in the US, the job in the White House, the job in Africa, in Europe, everywhere. That's our job. I'm not there to make money, to be close to people in the White House. And I understand that what I'm trying to do can be difficult. Most people come to Washington, D.C. to change things. But when they get to the White House and they fly on Air Force One and they become comfortable and they go to Sunday shows, they become afraid and they don't really ask the tough questions. They become friends to the government.
Simon, you've been labeled as being a disruptive reporter for voicing yourself. Some even called it heckling. Moreover, many of your own peers were demanding decorum at the time of the showdown. Do you feel betrayed by your press peers, especially the ones present at the press briefing that day?
No, I'm not. Doing the job is hard. Julian Assange is in prison today. He's in jail. He's been detained for the past 4 years because he said the truth. When you say the truth, when you publish the truth is hard. And very few people do it. People pretend to publish the truth, but in reality, in most countries around the world, they become close to the government. They become close to the people in power. And when you do the right thing, when you ask the right question and go after the truth, you will face backlash even from people in the media, in the briefing room, even from colleagues who are there, pretend to do the truth, to pretend to report the truth, but actually repeating the propaganda of the government in power. And what that means is, when the government issues a statement Maybe Russia bombed their own pipeline, or the inflation is temporary. They only repeat that. They don't investigate anything, and by the time we realize that that wasn't true, it's already too late, because millions of people have already watched
Right.
the propaganda and the press releases, and that's not my job. That's what I'm trying to explain. My job is not to be friends with anybody. My job is to do the job for the American people, the American allies, African and US interests. Anything else, I don't really, it doesn't bother me.
Right, Simon, on a day when Joe Biden has officially announced his re-election bid and pivoted that announcement video on the concept of freedom and democracy and how his governance believes in equality for all, do you find this announcement video rather ironical?
Yeah, exactly. When I watch those things, because I'm right in the White House, most people are not. The White House has only 49 seats in the press briefing, and a few other people stand. And when I see what has happened to me, the way I've been discriminated against, the way I've tried to do my job. Imagine if I'd gone to commit crime, maybe take a weapon and gone to shoot people on the street, or if I were really a bad person. But here I am just trying to do the job and trying to strengthen ties between US and Africa, because it's my belief that it's in the interest of Africa and the US to have stronger ties between US and Africa. And when I hear them talk about freedom and liberties and democracy, and I see that the First Amendment in the US, which protects freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to petition your government, to seek redress, or the right to peaceful assembly, I'm very disappointed, and I often feel very sad, seeing the level of hypocrisy and the level of, uh,
And,
it.
the irony is that it does come across as hypocrisy, especially if one were to compare Donald Trump and Biden's relationship with the press. Because Trump, remember, was notorious for his troubling relationship with the American media. And in fact, Joe Biden pledged a media reset after Trump. And yet he's being called out for the lack of that one-on-one interviews and formal news conferences. What's problematic about Joe Biden's relationship with the American press as of today?
So former President Trump was supposed to be the bad guy. He was supposed to be the guy who had this contentious or troubling relationship with the media. But he actually granted more interviews. He also he also granted more access to the news media. And right now, President Biden has now come to the White House briefing room since he became president nearly 3 years ago. I mean, very soon next year will be 3 years. And he's not come to the briefing room even once. And he's granted fewer press conferences and one-on-one interviews. And so in the end, and even when he attends those interviews, most time he doesn't take questions from journalists. And when he takes questions from journalists, he already has a list of reporters to call on. And so it goes like, I have 7 people to call on.
Right.
Meanwhile, there are 150 journalists in the briefing room, including me.
All right. Simon, before I let you go, President Biden has announced his bid for a re-election at a time when his own son, Hunter Biden's ties to the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and his wife, Evan Ryan, are under scrutiny. This when Hunter was on the Burisma board. With claims that there's political interference in Hunter Biden's investigation, can America trust Biden and his administration?
I can't speak for the American people, but I can say that if you go by the recent polls, almost 70% of Americans say they don't want President Biden to run for a second term. And if you look on the Republican side, what you realize is former President Trump has a clear lead, sometimes by 40% of Republicans who say that they want him to run for, to run for the GOP primary election. So I don't know, but clearly going by those polls, what you realize is people don't want President Biden to run again for election.
Right.
The only thing I will say for people watching now is to keep praying for me and keep going to my, Twitter handle and follow me and keep following me. If I can ask questions at the White House, at least they can read me on Twitter.